just one thing. A few people weren't able to stay, so there might be a little bit of room in front. Feel free to sort of, if you see an empty chair in the front. And it doesn't have to be a real question-answer. It can be, discussion, a comment, as long as it sort of pertains to the topics we're talking about. And I'm hopeful a lot of people will want to say stuff, so there's some value in trying to be very succinct in your way of expressing yourself. And I think we have our first comment. Yes, ma'am.
So at the beginning of your talk, you had said you were looking for ways that the Buddha had perhaps considered the broader picture at the social level. And I'm recalling Occupy Wall Street talk given by Bhikkhu Bodhi last year, maybe 14 months ago. Mm-hmm. And he provided a prescriptive list from the suttas for what a good monarch would do with the people, if I'm not mistaken. So sometimes I recall that, and then I look at how did the Buddha solve these problems, and as you said, he keeps going back, and on a case-by-case basis he provides prescriptions, like to a monarch, to someone who overeats. Each individual gets their own prescription, but in general he seems to have left behind some simple teaching. So when I think, I want to ask you two questions. I think when I get overwhelmed by the complexity of the infection we have in our society, the three poisons in a Buddhist way of saying, I look to his recommendations to all teachers. And I looked at, he taught three simple things, the three poisons, mm-hmm. Many things, but knowing that he understood the monarch mind, he could not possibly constantly give prescription after prescription, but he could anticipate that even the monarch was stressed. So he gave that prescription, but he always kept in mind we can suffer greed, hatred, or ill will and delusion. And then for teaching, for countering that, and this is how I approach, if I wanted to approach the corporate tax code, if I don't start with the three roots, if I get above that, then I feel like I'll get overwhelmed and I'll make a mistake. So I look at his 5 points for teachers and I think, how would I plan to address the three evil roots in corporate law, for example? And those 5 rules were, one, that we should teach it step by step. 2, we should be clear about studying cause and effect. 3, we should have the mind of compassion. 4, we should not look for material or status gain. And 5, that we should do this without disparaging ourselves or others. Yeah. So when attacking the three poisons, those are the 5 steps, challenging though they are. That's the only way I can grapple with something complete, is make sure I don't start with the foliage, mm-hmm. and I start at the root and form like a first order logic. So I want to know if you think that's satisfactory, if that's a way to grapple with this. Mm. And second, I think if we don't deal with the Abrahamic, I'm wondering how the other thing I see is maybe the same approach with some of the very strong Abrahamic traditions in this country, because clearly dissatisfaction, I think the argument that will come forward about our governance from the Abrahamic traditions is that by taking God out of the state, all of these defilements came up. And so I'm wondering where the successful collaborative conversation is with very strong Abrahamic traditions is. And again, I would answer that myself with those 5 points. It's the only thing I understand, and it simplifies things and prepares me for the difficulty. So do you think that is satisfactory, the 5 points are satisfactory on both fronts, or something else?
As I understand it, I think the 5 points are very valuable sort of guidelines for when we want to do something. They don't take us very far as answering specific about what it is we should do. It's more about how we do it. And it does raise, to my mind, a very interesting issue about sort of the relationship between personal and collective change. There's an awful lot of Buddhists, it seems to me, or at least I tend to keep encountering them, who basically think that if I change myself sufficiently, if I become a really different person, then inevitably that will sort of have effects on those around me. It will ripple out. And I think this is very important. If we don't start with ourselves, we're playing a kind of a game. It's really, we're not serious. As Buddhists, as practitioners, this is definitely, the place to focus when we begin. However, I also believe that that's not sufficient. In other words, it's not simply to say we don't have to think about the political, we're going to change people one by one. Given the kind of very critical situation we're in now, I think although we have to start with ourselves, we also have to come to some realization that, as I was trying to say, the problem isn't just individual motivations of individual people, ourselves and others around us, it's also these institutionalized motivations. What I'm really trying to refer to here is the kind of sociological paradox, where the sociologists say people create society. It's an aggregate of our ways of interacting that is society. And yet the other side of that, of course, is that society creates people, in the sense that there are social forces. In our society, there are massive economic and social forces that want us to define ourselves as consumers, that sort of try to keep us in that mold. So what I'm sort of getting at here is how I think we need to combine the two. The emphasis on personal transformation at the same time as the emphasis upon the social transformation. And I think your guidelines are valuable in application to both. The other thing that strikes me, maybe I'll just take advantage of this, is sometimes I think one of the most important things that Buddhism can contribute is the notion that, as I tried to emphasize, it's not simply a matter of social change, we also have to look in the personal dimension. And the example that I find within the Buddhist tradition that speaks so deeply to me is the notion of the Bodhisattva path. Because the real Bodhisattva, it seems to me, continues to work on both levels. He or she is working always, still have a meditation practice, still working on himself, herself. At the same time, they know that in itself is not sufficient, and that they're also out there. And I think we're in a situation where we're being called, I think we're being called to redefine the Bodhisattva path as far as not just helping other people wake up, but actually become activists working to address these larger social and institutional issues. So that's the two sides that I see, that the Bodhisattva works personally and also is also banding together, working together with other people trying to effect institutional change, and how the two actually work very well together. Because if you don't have the personal, it's so easy to get burned out, to get angry, to dualize us versus them, and also to feel frustrated when you're not able to achieve what you hope to. So that's why the personal practice is so important as far as helping balance that out. It's really by combining those two, I think we have a new conception of how social change might be approached. And I think that's really not only exciting, there's a sense in which this is becoming urgent. This is becoming something, it's as if the earth is calling all of us right now to become bodhisattvas, if we're going to be able to address the crises. Your second point, briefly, so many of the important social changes have been connected with churches. You think of, they were at the heart of anti-slavery, and they were at the heart of a civil rights movement. And so I think there are within the churches, within a lot of the churches, there is this concern for social transformation. And I think I certainly don't see the issue as sort of Buddhists setting up our own political party or our own movement. Rather, it's a matter of finding allies, and I think the more progressive churches are a natural way to work. Clearly, that's something like that's going to be absolutely necessary. Thank you. I think yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to find out what my comment is as I make it. The Buddha walked the earth 2,500 years ago, and here we are. And other great spiritual teachers have been present, and here we are. I personally engaged. I'm right now in the middle of training people to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience so they can get arrested in relation to some environmental issue, the Keystone thing. I have no attachment to the outcome of that action because there's nothing I can do about it. And over time, 120 years ago in America, there was a Gilded Age, and then all of a sudden there was time when the unions got together and it changed for a while. And this is a flux that happens in human culture. And I don't necessarily feel that the world is threatened with anything other than asteroids. The world is fine. Many species will suffer, and when that shakeout happens, new species will develop. And if we don't take an anthropocentric perspective, you've got what I'm saying, and the rest would just be another attempt to formulate it. So I'll stop.
Thank you for expressing that, because I think that's a really essential dimension. And in a way, I was trying to point to that a little bit when I talked. I don't know if they want me in front of this thing or not, anyway. When I talked about the two aspects of the Bodhisattva path, okay, my own background is Zen, and we talk about realizing our essential nature. And I think that's what you were pointing to, the sense that there's something there that, whether or not human beings survive or not, whether or not we're able to achieve the kind of results we want from our activism, there's still some fundamental, what do you call it, emptiness. We talk a lot about that in the Zen tradition. There is a sense that there's something there that won't be lost, right? From the emptiness perspective, there's nothing to gain or lose. There's no birth and no death. There's no better and no worse. And it's very important in our practice to sort of touch in that dimension. However, only to stay there would be one-sided. And I think this is your own view as well. As in the Heart Sutra, form is emptiness. It's important to realize the sort of emptiness dimension as we talk about it in Zen. But also emptiness is form. That is to say, we don't want to devalue the forms, the species, the many ways in which emptiness manifests. And there's a little bit of a danger here. I do find this in some Buddhists that I've talked with, how it's too quick to sort of dwell in the cave of emptiness and say from the essential dimension, nothing is going to be lost. Well, yes, but that's only half of it. I also think we need to appreciate, the wonderful ways in which the emptiness is manifested or taken form as all of us, as society, and that's something precious. If it ends up being destroyed, so be it. But it's unfortunate, something there is lost. What's nice to know is that even if, as is very possible, the higher life forms may disappear due to extreme climate change, it's nice to know that, Mother Earth will find other ways, other species will develop. It's not going to be the end of creativity. But see, this is the tricky thing. It's like, it's balancing these two dimensions. It's fully realizing and respecting and having some groundedness in that fundamental dimension of emptiness, but also in a way that doesn't denigrate the social, the form, the lower truth. And I think what I like about, say, the Bodhisattva path is that, we're not sacrificing one for the other, but rather we're acknowledging that they're really two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, well, it may have been evident already. My practice has been within the Vipassana tradition, and when you talk about essences,
true nature.
Exactly.
True nature that is no nature, as Hakuin put it. So yeah, I don't mean, well, sometimes we talk about Buddha nature in the Mahayana, but to me, the differences are language, yeah. Yes, ma'am, and then the gentleman behind you.
Thank you. Would you please integrate two words, particularly in the parts 2 and 3 of your presentation, and they are Dharma and pantheism.
Pantheism. Okay, I don't think I use the word pantheism at all. I think that would take quite a while that would get us into the kind of metaphysics and ontology that I fully enjoy, but I think I'd probably bore almost everyone else here in the audience. So I'd rather not sort of try to unpack pantheism, except maybe in the sense that, at least in the Zen tradition that I practiced in, the idea is not to transcend this world, but to realize its true nature. And, metaphorically we could say that is a kind of transcendence. But the important point is something like this, that, we normally don't experience what the world really is or who we really are because we've sort of constructed it. We've in the process of growing up, we become socialized, we gain a sense of self. We don't really understand what's going on. But the point of Buddhist practice, as I understand it, and certainly Zen, is to deconstruct the sense of separation between myself and the rest of the world, to deconstruct, but also to reconstruct the sense of self in a more healthy, more participatory way. So a healthy sense of self is very important. It's not as though the idea is to get rid of the self or the sense of self, but rather to, as we say in Zen, realize its emptiness and then to live in a more non-dual way. A self, and this is the Bodhisattva path, as I understand it. We start out preoccupied with ourselves, and this applies also to our Buddhist practice. We suffer in a variety of ways. We come to Buddhism because we're unhappy in some way with our lives. So we start there, but ultimately, as we begin to wake up, as we realize that we're not separate from the world, but rather each of us is one of the many ways in which the whole world sort of comes together right here. In the process of realizing that and integrating it more deeply into our lives, the challenge is to turn around the meaning of our lives. Instead of asking, what can I get out of this situation? The usual, what's in it for me? Turning it around. And the Bodhisattva question is, since I realize that I'm not separate from this situation, what can I do to make it better? And this is a kind of reorientation of the whole personality. And it's a really, I think, important part of the path. And what I've tried to do today, of course, is emphasize the concern for the social transformation as part of that process. So it's not just what can I do personally, but also trying to understand larger social forces that perpetuate dukkha and suffering. So I haven't really answered your question, but that's the best I can do. And there's a gentleman behind you who wanted to raise something.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for your teachings today and in your writings. I'm glad you brought up sociology. I actually am a sociologist, and I find your work very helpful in my work. And I wanted to bring up some sociological points to try and make sense of your talk. In Buddhism, the idea is that you free yourself by forgetting yourself. And in the West, it seems like you free yourself you relieve the suffering of the self by embracing the self or emphasizing the self. And I think we have ideas of individualism and the neoliberal imperative, which not only create problems for the self, but the social justice that you said the West emphasizes. Neoliberalism and the individualism promote social justice for the individual. That I want to save myself, and we're not maybe that willing to have redistribution of wealth or taxes for everybody. So it seems like there's a bit of I don't know if there's a paradox, but an obstacle into trying to merge the two because of those forces in particularly in the United States, but in the West. We do focus a lot on the self here, but it's all, more self, the therapeutic self, embrace the self, not freeing the self or forgetting the self like in Buddhism. I'm just curious, what you might think about that.
No, that seems exactly right to me. That so much of the emphasis on human rights, etc., in the West has been on rights, and very much constrained to the individual. And one of the ways that manifests, of course, is that the emphasis on rights rather than a correlative concern for responsibilities, right? Responsibilities to others. One thing I think Buddhism implies is that although we start with the individual concern to address our own dukkha, as I've been saying and re-saying, as we begin to do that, as we begin to sort of forget ourselves or realize that we're not separate from other people, then I think that's a kind of natural correction to this sort of extreme individualism that we're all concerned about in the West. I think, quite frankly, we're all starved for community. And I think if Buddhism is really understood clearly here, it implies that the delusion of a separate self that can promote its own well-being indifferent, from other people. I mean, Buddhism emphasizes interdependence. It emphasizes relationship, right? And it's quite fascinating the way some recent work in the last decade or two, not only by psychologists, but sociologists, economists, and so forth, finding out that in terms of what makes people happy, after a pretty low level of income, making sure you got a roof, etc., there's no real correlation between rising income and happiness. But the correlation is, as you know, is with relationships. The thing that is most important for quality of life in terms of how people experience themselves as happy is the quality of their relationships with other people. In other words, community. And clearly that's something that we need to move toward, even in the Buddhist world, if I may say it. I think, at least in the Zen world, I notice, we have lots of Buddha teachers, we have lots of Dharma teachings, but when we come to Sangha, at least in the Zen world, it's too often we're relating to the greatly enlightened, supposedly enlightened Zen master, and not enough the spiritual friends, the Kalyana Mitra. And I think this is something that American Buddhism needs to work on, a much stronger sense of how much we need each other and how much we can learn from each other. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
There's a question to the left and then back to the lady.
Thank you very much for bringing the sociological aspects. That's something that I miss very often, especially being a student of the Russian school, in which it's very important, and the whole concept of Chaktavari is very well developed and very much studied, and interestingly enough, during the Soviet period. Because they're interested, obviously, in sociological questions, so some very, very good stuff has been written about that. And but that brings me to the other, and obviously, your own optimism about Buddhism, contribution to Buddhism by the West is something that warms my heart, because I'm a full believer that the new Buddhisms, revived Buddhism, if you want to say modernized Buddhism, West has a very important role to play. That being said, I want to throw a question that perhaps is a little bit of a trick question. What do you do when the people or democracy is the Chaktavaryan? And what is the Buddhist answer to that?
Again, it's a very interesting issue, especially, as I was saying before, if you have a democracy where still people are largely motivated by greed, ill will, delusion, is that any better ultimately from any other social system, Especially if, as seems to be happening, a very small number of people and corporations sort of take control of the whole system. I think it's important to remember that Buddhism is something alive. My sense, Buddhism isn't what the Buddha said, it's what the Buddha started. And in his time, issues of democracy, human rights as we know them, just didn't exist. But what's exciting is that the Buddhist emphasis on impermanence and insubstantiality also applies to itself. So we see this when Buddhism went to China. It interacts with Taoism and Confucianism and Chan or Zen results. When it goes to Tibet, it interacts, the Tantric Buddhism from India interacts with the native Bon, and something new is created. So I think Buddhism has this self-transformative potential. And now, we live at this extraordinary time where Buddhism comes not just to the West, but it becomes globalized, it becomes an important part of the globalized civilization, and it's interacting with something as different as what I'm trying to say is that I think it's the greatest challenge that Buddhism has ever faced. But it works both ways. Many of us are familiar with Toynbee's prediction that when historians look back upon the 20th century, they will emphasize Buddhism coming to the West. But it's also the West and the modern world coming to Buddhism. And it's this really exciting interaction, which is happening in a number of ways. Not primarily with Christianity. I think it's, up to this point, probably most of all with psychology. But also in this concern for social issues and larger collective ways of understanding dukkha and how it is that it might be addressed. I think what I'm trying to get at here is, we need to be somewhat courageous in not just clinging to the original, but being willing to bring the basic principles into this new situation and being open to new possibilities. I guess what I'm saying is, if the Buddha isn't alive in us, then Buddhism is dead. We simply can't cling to the old ways of doing things in a world that is engaged with such dukkha, with such crises. We really have to be open to new ways of thinking, new ways of acting, new types of Buddhism, such as this new bodhisattva path that I tried to allude to earlier. So, whereas I don't think Buddhism really has any simple answer to give us to the question about democracy, I think Buddhism can empower us based on fundamental Buddhist principles, so that we're motivated not by greed, ill, delusion, but by generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom. And with those motivations, then we have a certain freedom, a certain responsibility to do the best we can to address the crises we have. I think it's so urgent for us to sort of have this creative understanding of the Buddhist tradition, that in order to remain the Buddhist tradition, it needs to be self-transforming. It needs to be adapting to very different situations. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your teaching. I just kind of left the life of an activist and have been focusing on my own practice, but I'm very uncomfortable with the fact that I'm privileged enough to be able to do that. And so the fact you outlining that there's a way in between and it's not either one or the other is really helpful. I wanted to share a positive story that there are groups of trade unionists out there who are trustees of public pension funds, and against lots of vested interests, they are putting forth theories of institutional asset ownership that promotes what's called ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues, seeing that their fiduciary duty is to ensure that the beneficiaries of the pension funds in 50 or 100 years are still around. And therefore, just focusing on short-term quarterly earnings is inconsistent if you're also ruining the earth and the economy. So that's a good thing. I am somewhat uncomfortable with your letting the oil company CEO off the hook so easily. And I think that if the Jamie Dimons and Lloyd Blankfeins and the other men who control not only the economy but the government through in the post-Citizens United world were to collectively decide to act in a different way, they could achieve change. And so I struggle with not feeling ill will towards them, and it's a continual challenge. But do you have any ideas for how such men could be approached?
Thank you. In response, I can tell you a story, but let me just first mention your concern about the power of CEOs. I mean, I think that's a very valid point. What I didn't talk enough about, of course, is that with large corporations, when you ask about the factors, the causal relations that cause certain people to rise up, it encourages a certain let me be blunt about it. Sociopaths. And psychopaths are, when you look at the top levels of corporations, they're represented a lot more than in the population as a whole. So the corporate structure encourages a certain kind of manipulative mentality, which is part of the challenge. How do you appeal to the conscience of a sociopath or a psychopath? I had one experience last year. I read in a magazine about a professor in the MBA program at Harvard, a well-known businessman named William George. And he was promoting the value of mindfulness and meditation in the business world because it makes you a lot more efficient. It'll really work better for the corporation and so forth. And I was struck by this, so I checked him out online, and I discovered that not only is he on the board of Goldman Sachs, and has been for a long time, but also on the board of ExxonMobil, two of the most hated corporations in the world for good reason, as you know. And so I actually wrote the guy a letter. I said, you've been on the board, I appreciate you're not day-to-day business and all that, but can you tell us how your meditation, you've been meditating since the mid-70s, how does your meditation affect your understanding about corporate responsibility, et cetera, and you know what he said? He said nothing, of course. He never responded to my letter. And I eventually went public with the letter. It's on the BPF website, But so there are some cases where it evidently doesn't seem to have much impact, even if people actually meditate. On the other side, there is this mindfulness movement, and in some cases, there does seem to be support for the idea that regardless of your initial motivations, mindfulness can, at least in some cases, encourage more empathy for other people. So that may be one of the ways in which Buddhism will have some impact within the society. But if we understand it in a corporate way as making us more efficient and making corporations more profitable, then I think we're missing what Buddhism really has to offer. Slavoj Žižek, this well-known European philosopher, for some reason he's a bit interested in Buddhism, although he doesn't really seem to understand it very well. But he's a very acute cultural critic, and he's made the point that in his opinion, Buddhism is the perfect ideology for 21st century consumer capitalism. Why? Well, think about it. Peace of mind, leave me alone. I'm going to de-stress. I'm going to find my own serenity, my own awakening. Buddhism can be used in this way to sort of find a little bit of sanity in an insane world and sort of help you cope better. Buddhism can become a kind of coping mechanism in a world gone crazy. And that's my fear, that's my concern, that this is happening. I'm not saying this is the only thing that's happening, but this is happening. And the danger is if this is the main thing that happens, then the real potential of the alternative perspective that Buddhism can offer and the awakening is lost. So there's a challenge, there's a tension right now within the Western, especially the American Buddhist community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
It seems
I don't know. This is on.
The microphone is
Oh, okay, sorry. I'm technically challenged here. But it seems to me that there's a solution to the whole corporate problem, and that's to activate all of the stock owners and educate them that they do have the power to change the structure of a corporation for good rather than for evil. And it's just a matter of education. And it's the same thing with commercialism, too. It's a matter of educating the public what's really good for the earth and what's good for themselves. And so I think there are solutions that exist within the structure itself.
I would personally agree that that's part of the solution. But again, that's working solely on the individual one by one. I also think, though, as a number of people have proposed, I think we need to rewrite corporate charters. This is huge, because corporations have an umbilical cord. In order to function, they have to have a charter that's given by the state. And the way the charters have evolved, they need to do less and less. It's like they're basically, the corporations have bought the judges and the legislatures who write the charters, right? So we need a people's movement that will demand that charters emphasize that corporations have a social responsibility. It's not just about emphasizing the return on your investment. And I think that's an essential part of the transformation that's necessary as well.
The other part of that solution is the social media, so that when people become activated and they say that the corporation is not following a good charter, so to speak, they can change the will of the corporation for good rather than for evil.
I believe that there is now in New York State a new kind of corporate charter that's in the last few years been designed that includes this corporate responsibility. I don't know if it's only for nonprofits or not, but there are moves in this direction that I think could be really valuable. So, question in the. We've come full circle. Yes, ma'am.
So, this is going to work a little bit on what we've spoken about as a group, and also to my point earlier. When you wrote to William George, and this is also going to ask about annihilationism and dictatorial views when a dictator will want to purify the land. When you wrote the letter to William George, did you plan, the Buddha is very, very patient in teaching step by step with regard to cause and effect in a compassionate mind. Did you write that individual knowing that there is an ally, trusting that within that person is someone one can love like their only child? And did you anticipate, or did you just take one non-answer and make use of them as an object to broadcast publicly, sort of locking them into a villainous role, in which case that is annihilationism. It's annihilating a person. Whereas if one had gone back and said, the 3 poisons are in me, and I follow a step-by-step way, I might create a strategy. I've also had ill will for CEOs. I've also worked for hedge funds and seen the great efforts people make, not just patting themselves on the back, but truly humble efforts. Not just to save something to justify their exploits elsewhere. And I'm aware that it is really it's much, much, much harder for me to sit down and come up with a logical proposal like non-harm and see it in corporation, which is obligated to make a profit. It takes a lot more skill for me to develop step-by-step cause and effect. It's a lot easier for me to objectify a person and feel ill will for them. So I guess I'm wondering, did you give your counterparty a chance to be a great ally and a great Buddha? And did you come up with a step-by-step plan to cultivate that? And I don't mean that to be insulting. I ask myself this question too. It's so much more challenging for me to do that, to think, it may go badly in the beginning, but in 20 years, how will it be? How can I plan that?
Fair enough question. What's good is you can to some extent, check for yourself by going on the Buddhist Peace Fellowship website, because the whole letter is there. And as you'll see, the letter is very respectful. I'm not in any way insulting or even challenging him, but I'm asking him to offer his perspective on the social responsibility of corporations. So there's no confrontation. I'm not objectifying him, but I'm really asking him, would he please give us his perspective? Because as a very experienced CEO and MBA teacher, I think he certainly has a lot to offer. And I was actually hopeful. I won't say I expected an answer, but I was hopeful because he has some pretty strong Buddhist connections. He's been associated with the Mind and Life Foundation. I believe he's attended one or two of the meetings with the Dalai Lama. He himself actually put on a little conference with the Tibetan Rinpoche about mindfulness. So he has had some Buddhist exposure, and so I wrote to him as a Buddhist practitioner and as a Buddhist scholar, asking if he would give us his perspective on this, but there was simply no answer. And so from there, where does one go? I'm sure there's other things I can do, but in the meantime, since he didn't respond for like 6 months, then I decided to, make the letter public.
So if I do something and I look and I present myself well, I've assured that I make myself look good. I've done this to counterparties on the internet as well, and I've presented myself well and fairly. Mm-hmm. What I end up doing, though, is perhaps creating someone who does not any longer feel safe to respond, or has, by me shining, by courteously speaking, perhaps I create, even subtly knowing that they do not look good by responding, or they do not look good by their response. And I find the greater challenge for myself is to figure out, and I look at the Buddhist strategy of really carefully trying to give someone a path and a means.
Okay. From my side, given who he is, given his situation, he has a great responsibility, okay? He's a very successful corporate leader. He teaches MBA at Harvard. He writes best-selling business books about the importance of mindfulness and meditation in the business world. And he is on a number of corporate boards, including Goldman Sachs and ExxonMobil. And as I said before, many of us would appreciate that those are two of the more problematical corporations. And in my letter, I sort of cited, some of the issues with them. And I just want to know his perspective. Now, it could be that I haven't been sensitive enough in some way, but I tried to be. And I think that he has some responsibility, given his position, given his wealth, given his power. He has some responsibility to respond to this kind of polite, well-intended letter. So, I'm not going to feel guilty that he didn't respond to my letter. You know what I mean? Yeah. Yeah. But I appreciate there's a real danger here of us versus them. And I have the answers. I'm the good guy. You're the evil guy. And when I was writing the letter, I really, I'm aware of these problems. I'm aware of these dangers. I'm aware of my own ego to some extent. So I really try to, keep that in check and not create an us versus him, mentality. I would have been happy if he responded, but for whatever reason, he didn't feel that he could, or he wouldn't bother. Why would he? He's a very important, busy guy. Why would he bother respond to somebody like me?
So there's no need to give up on that either, is there? There's still a way to cultivate if you choose, because he is powerful and he is an influence and you are drawn to him. Then the path, the strategy or the
yeah. Maybe there will be some opportunity to pursue it in some way. It's a good question.
So I'm thinking about last two questions because it's 4:15. Okay. So if anybody has any comment or question, last two. Okay.
I mean, we're talking about Buddhism in the West, but what about Buddhism back in, I guess, the home countries, like in Japan and Taiwan? These are fully functioning market democracies. and they both have very strong Buddhist influences. I can personally attest to, in Taiwan, Tzu Chi and all those organizations, but I haven't really got a sense of, how Buddhism is interacting with social justice and issues of inequality and stuff like that in those countries. Maybe you could talk a little about Japan and Taiwan. I have talked with monks who are studying Zenjen Fojiao, the human realm Buddhism, and they seem to be very wary of, dealing with politics or, social economics at all. One thing I can say that is very positive from this standpoint is they're all very heavily into environmentalism. So that's kind of, touches upon many issues, consumption and economic growth and stuff like that, but in a less direct and confrontational way. So that's my question.
Oh, thank you. Yes. I actually lived almost 30 years in Singapore and in Japan, so I've had ample opportunity to sort of, travel and experience just about all the Buddhist societies there. Taiwan is quite unique and quite impressive, given the attitude toward women, and also Tzu Chi. I mean, in many ways, Buddhism there seems quite progressive. I've been very involved in Thailand and Southeast Asia with the International Network of Engaged Buddhists. And so there are a number of sort of progressive Buddhist groups that are really trying to bring in some of these concerns that I was expressing into a society, let's be honest, the Sangha in a place, the official Sangha in a place like Thailand tends to be quite conservative and really doesn't want to deal with these issues. It's doing its own thing. Japan is an interesting case. From very early days, Japanese Buddhism was quite unique in the way that it was imported by the emperors to sort of support the ruling family, and it never had a kind of very critical edge there. And then after the Meiji Restoration, monks could officially get married, which is often just normalizing a relationship that was already there. And they can eat meat, and basically what happened to Japanese Buddhism is that it became kind of funeral Buddhism. The temples made a lot of money with funerals, and the association between Buddhism and death, how you cope with death, how you purify death, that was kind of the focus of Japanese Buddhism for a long time. Interestingly, though, just since the horrible earthquake, tsunami, and the nuclear meltdown, there is actually a kind of resurgence of concern, especially within a lot of the Buddhist community, to address the problem of nuclear power. And that disaster, which, as you know, is still ongoing, far from over, may be getting worse, for all we know, when they try to extract the fuel rods. It does seem like, and it's just what you said, it's environmental. The impact, the danger, has really sort of inspired a lot of the Buddhist groups to get more politically active and involved. And of course in Japan, the only society ever to have experienced nuclear bombs, the issue of nuclear pollution is huge. And the disillusionment with TEPCO and a really incompetent government is enormous. So I guess I'm hopeful that there does seem to be the development of social engagement within Japan, within Korea, within South. I think things are developing now. And partly, interestingly, I think it's also due to some Western influence. Sulak Sivaraksha, the founder of INEB, the International Network of Engaged Buddhists in Bangkok, he was educated in Wales, in England, so this interaction continues. And I think there's hope that social engagement will become more important to the Asian Buddhist traditions as well. One last comment or question? If not, let me just make one last point, partly or largely in response to something that was expressed to me by a couple of different people during the break, and a certain kind of pessimism. It's like I presented a pretty dim picture of the situation that we're in today. But I just want to emphasize that at the same time as this situation is difficult, especially because the people who benefit most in the short run from the present system are the ones who control the present system, right? That's the challenge, the immediate challenge. At the same time, there is some groundswell of transformation that's happening that I see Buddhism as being a part of. I'm particularly referring to Blessed Unrest. Can anybody remind me the author of that book? Paul Hawken, yes. Fascinating book. Paul Hawken has written about natural capitalism and so forth, traveled around the world giving talks, collecting business cards. And he started to realize that something extraordinary is happening today. That for the first time in human history, there are this enormous number of mostly small groups that are sort of springing forth from the earth to work for social justice and sustainability. And it's not a matter of a communist conspiracy. There's no one ideology. There's no one leadership. But what it seems to be reflecting is, I really think, a kind of transformation of consciousness in the direction that we all feel is necessary. In the book, he estimated there are between 1 million and 1.5 million of these groups. Now, if you look at his TED Talk, you see that he now estimates there are well over 2 million of these groups. 2 million. And if you think about that, now, many of them are small. Maybe they're concerned about the little grove of trees that the bypass is going to cut down or something. But think about what this means, There is something happening. There is a transformation of consciousness. I see Buddhism as being one part of that. Perhaps it's not as though we have to go out and create a movement and save the world. Something is happening, and we have a role to play within that. Maybe we can, two things concern me. So much of the movement in the past came out of the left, Marxism, very critical of religion. Religion is part of the problem, right? And I can appreciate that when you look at the role of religion. So often, the hierarchies have been in cahoots with the kings and the emperors, and they're part of the problem. What Buddhism can show, though, of course, is that the heart, the essence of a genuine religion is about personal transformation, working, transforming our own greed, ill will, and delusion. And I think Buddhism shows more clearly than any other tradition that I'm aware of how in this great movement of social transformation, we also need to continue making efforts to transform ourselves, going back to that two-sidedness of the Bodhisattva. So, rather than getting pessimistic that time is short, and it is, ecologically, there is something really important happening, far greater than any of us individually or collectively, and I see this wonderful Buddhist tradition as being able to play a role, not starting new political parties or anything, but rather bringing the Buddhist perspective into these larger social activist groups. 350.org, etc., etc. Pick your favorite group. There are so many groups working to change things, and I think it's really important for us as part of our own personal practice, right? This isn't a sacrifice. This is our own part of our practice. Our practice isn't simply what we're doing when we're sitting down meditating or studying Dharma books. We need to understand that finding ways to address these larger social challenges, this too is part of our practice. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Professor David. You can sit now. Please have a seat. He has been lecturing standing for the whole time. And I just want to, before you leave, we just want to give some introduction about this Dharma series. We started this series since 2009, and it was initiated by our abbot, Dhammadipha. And it's been a 4 years process, and it's a lot of efforts put into this kind of lecture series. And people don't know how much efforts we have been doing, but I think at least our abbot Dhammadipha knows. And so, Dhammadipha, do you want to speak something? No. Yeah, just a little bit. Oh, okay. And also we are very appreciate Professor David Lloyd to come to give this talk, and hopefully in the future you can come back again. It's a very wonderful, encouraging talk. Okay. So Professor David Lloyd, do you mind that we have a group picture later with whoever interesting to join the group photos? We will do it later. And right now, we have some small gifts. Oh, okay. So, so thank you very much to join us. So hope to see you next year. And if you want to know the future events, and you can sign up your email list in front of the sign desk over there. And right now we might need some help to help us moving the chairs and tables. Yes, thank you very much. So we will have the group photo right now. So if anybody wants to join the group photo, you can stay. Thank you.